There's a bus sitting on a barren lot in the middle of nowhere. Rust blooms across its yellow skin like a disease. The windows are clouded over. The tires have gone soft. Nobody wants it. Nobody ever did. $300. That's what John Jones paid for it. Not because he was starting an adventure, not because he saw potential where others saw junk. He bought it because that's all the money he had left in the world, and he needed somewhere to sleep that night. Here's where it gets interesting, and where most people miss the real story. Because what John didn't know, what nobody could have known, is that someone had spent years turning this worthless bus into a vault. Custom-built compartments hidden beneath the seats, climate-controlled safes engineered into the floorboards, a collection worth millions, sealed away and forgotten. The Jewel Promise: how a desperate man's survival purchase becomes a life-changing discovery. And the darker thread underneath, what it costs to uncover something that was meant to stay hidden. But we're getting ahead. Let me show you how he got there. John Jones had a job once. Assembly line work. Nothing glamorous, but it paid. It kept a roof over him and Amelia's heads. It kept the lights on. Then the plant closed. No warning, no severance worth mentioning. Just a notice taped to the employee board and a parking lot full of people walking out for the last time. He looked for other work, looked hard, but the town had already bled dry. Every factory within 50 miles was either closed or cutting. 6 months of interviews that went nowhere. 6 months of watching his savings drain. Rent came due. He couldn't pay it. The landlord didn't care about his situation. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday. He had maybe $2,000 left after everything sold, a car that wasn't worth much, some furniture no one wanted. He spent $1,500 getting a place for him and Amelia to sleep while he figured out his next move. That left him with $500 and a 9-year-old daughter, who was old enough to understand something was wrong, but young enough to still believe her father could fix it. That's when someone mentioned the bus. It was sitting on a lot at the edge of town, a yellow school bus, retired, unwanted. The guy selling it didn't even care about the condition. He just wanted it gone. John looked it over. The engine still turned. The frame was solid. The price was $300. He paid it in cash and drove away, knowing he'd just bought the last safety net he was ever going to have. The lot itself was nothing. No utilities, no neighbors within a mile. Just dirt and weeds and the kind of isolation that comes from having nowhere else to go. John pulled the bus there and started making it livable. He bought a camping stove with some of the money he had left. He fixed a leak in the roof. He cleaned out years of dust and debris. Amelia helped without complaining. Kids do that sometimes. They understand desperation before they understand language. They ate cheap, ramen mostly, sometimes canned beans heated on the camping stove. Water came from a gas station 5 miles away. Mornings were cold. Evenings were colder. There was no heater that worked. There was no insulation. Just metal walls and the sound of wind pushing through gaps. But it was theirs, and it kept them alive. John was in the back of the bus one morning, running his hand along the underside of a seat, checking for rot or damage he could fix. His daughter was outside playing with rocks in the dirt. His hand caught on something, a floorboard that shifted when it shouldn't have. Loose, deliberate, like it was meant to move. He stopped, pulled his hand back. Something told him to look closer. Something told him this bus had a secret. He pried at the floorboard with his fingers, not wanting to damage it. The edge lifted. Dust fell in a thin cloud, catching the light. The smell hit first, stale air that hadn't moved in years, sealed behind metal. Underneath wasn't rot. Underneath wasn't damage to fix. Underneath was metal. Clean metal. Deliberate metal. A compartment. Built into the frame itself, not a loose panel, not accidental wear. This was engineered, designed. Someone had taken the time to build this carefully into the bus's bones. John's hands started shaking a little. He pulled the floorboard up all the way and set it aside. The compartment ran the length of the seat, sealed with precision he didn't expect to find in a bus that looked like it had been abandoned since the 70s. The metal was clean, polished. No rust, no corrosion. The hinges moved smoothly when he opened it, like they'd been maintained, like someone cared about them. Inside was a cloth pouch. Canvas, faded brown, the kind people used decades ago to carry things that mattered. He lifted it. Heavy, solid. The weight surprised him. He opened the pouch with care, not knowing what he was about to find, just knowing his hands were trembling enough that he had to work slowly. Coins spilled into his palm. Not pennies, not quarters. Old coins, heavy coins, different colors, different weights, different textures. Some bore dates from the 1800s. The markings were intricate, intentional. The kind of detail you don't see on modern currency. The age was unmistakable. These weren't random. These were collected. He reached back into the pouch and found something else. Sleeves. Protective sleeves you buy from stamp and coin dealers. Inside those sleeves were stamps. Not modern stamps. Rare ones. From different countries, different eras. He recognized a few of the countries, Switzerland, France, Germany, Britain, but he didn't recognize their significance. Not yet. What he recognized was the care. Every single stamp was preserved, organized, protected like treasure, handled only by someone who understood what they had. This wasn't a quick hiding spot. This wasn't panic money stashed away. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had built this compartment with intention. Someone had treated this collection like it mattered more than almost anything else in their life. John sat back on his heels. His mind was working through the implications but hitting a wall each time. Where had the bus come from? Who owned it before him? How long had this been sealed beneath this seat? He looked at the coins again, really looked at them. The weight, the detail, the precision of every marking. His stomach tightened with a feeling he couldn't name yet. It was between hope and fear, between disbelief and something close to understanding. But this was just one compartment. He looked down the length of the bus floor. How many seats were there? 8? 10? Maybe more? And each seat had a floorboard beneath it. Each floorboard could hide something. John stood up, still holding the pouch, and walked toward the back of the bus. His legs felt unsteady. He knelt by the next seat and ran his hand along the underside like he'd done with the first one. The floorboard moved, just like the other one, just like it was designed to move. He opened it. Another compartment, another cloth pouch inside. Coins again, stamps again. This collection just as carefully preserved as the first one. He didn't need to check the third seat to know what he'd find, but he did anyway. And the fourth, and the fifth. Each one the same, each one sealed, each one waiting. John stood in the middle of his bus, the bus he'd bought for $300 because it was all the money he had, and realized he was standing inside a vault, a mobile museum. A secret that someone had built with precision and care, then abandoned to time. Or forgotten. Or maybe meant specifically for him to find. He worked through the bus methodically after that. Not frantically, methodically. There was something in the precision of what he was finding that demanded respect. He moved from seat to seat, lifting floorboards, opening compartments. Each one contained the same careful arrangement. Stamps in protective sleeves, coins in cloth pouches, everything organized by country, by era, by condition. Nothing was random, nothing was thrown together. This wasn't someone hiding cash from a divorce or stashing money from taxes. This was a collection, a life's work. The craftsmanship started to sink in as he really looked at the compartments themselves. The metal wasn't just welded, it was fitted with precision. The hinges moved without binding, the seals were airtight. He found desiccant packets inside, the kind used to keep moisture out. Climate control. Someone had engineered climate control into a school bus
to preserve stamps and coins.
The kind of commitment that takes money, knowledge, time. He counted 12 compartments in total, 12 sealed vaults built into the floorboards of a bus that looked like scrap metal from the outside. The dissonance was almost overwhelming. Everything about this bus screamed worthless. Everything beneath those floorboards screamed irreplaceable. By the time he finished cataloging, Emilia was hungry. He made her ramen on the camping stove while his mind stayed in the compartments. Coins from the 1800s, British stamps, French ones, German ones. Some with images he didn't recognize, some with denominations that didn't make sense in modern currency. He kept thinking about the weight, the care, the intention behind every single item. After she was asleep, he took what he'd found to the bus's small window and opened up his phone. An old phone. A cheap plan with spotty internet, but enough to search. He started with the coins, found a numismatist forum, posted photos, asked questions carefully, not wanting to sound ignorant. The responses came slowly, but they came. The first coin he'd held, an 1872 Swiss franc in near-perfect condition, was worth more than $500. A British sovereign from 1897 was worth $800. A rare American dime with a mint error was worth thousands. He moved to the stamps, found a philatelist community, posted images of the ones that looked oldest. The responses made his hands shake. A stamp from the British Guiana series, one of the rarest stamps in existence, a variant that had sold at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had one. In his bus. In a protective sleeve, preserved with care. A Jenny invert, or something close to it. A stamp printed upside down by accident in 1918. Those had sold in auctions for millions. $2 million. A single stamp. He kept searching through the night. Each price he found felt less real than the last. $2,000 for a stamp. $10,000 for a set. $50,000 for a rare variant. The numbers stopped making sense. They became abstract. They became impossible. By sunrise, he'd estimated a conservative valuation. He didn't know enough to be precise, but the lowest number he'd come up with was $800,000. The highest was over $2 million. He sat in the bus as light started coming through the clouded windows. Emilia was still asleep in the back. The camping stove was cold. His phone was dying. And he was a man who'd had $300 in the world 12 hours earlier. Now he had everything. Or nothing. He didn't know which one yet. Because everything had changed, and he had no idea what to do with it. John didn't sleep that night. He sat in the bus with the compartments open, the stamps and coins laid out in their protective sleeves, trying to decide if what he'd found was real or if his mind had constructed an elaborate fantasy out of desperation. By morning, he knew he had to know for sure. He couldn't live in the space between doubt and hope. He had to know if this was salvation or illusion. He called a numismatist, found one online, a man named Julian Vane who worked out of a small office 2 towns over. He didn't mention the bus, didn't explain his situation, just said he had a collection he needed appraised and asked if Vane took walk-ins. Vane said he did, but it would take time. A proper appraisal takes time. John loaded a box with the most impressive pieces, the British Guiana stamp, a few of the oldest coins, the ones he'd researched enough to know were significant. He didn't bring everything. He couldn't risk losing it all if Vane turned out to be a thief. Emilia went to school that day. He hadn't pulled her out, hadn't let her isolation match his, and John drove to town with the box sitting on the passenger seat like it contained something alive. Vane's office was clean, organized, the kind of place that whispered competence. He was a thin man with gray at his temples, the kind of face that had spent decades looking at small details with precision. John set the box on his desk and waited while Vane opened it, watched his expression shift from professional curiosity to something else, something like recognition. "Where did you get these?" Vane said, not a question, a statement that demanded an answer. I inherited a bus, John said. These were sealed inside the floorboards. Vane picked up the British Guiana stamp with tweezers, held it under a light, put it down carefully, picked it up again, examined it for maybe 3 minutes without speaking. I need you to come back tomorrow, he said, with everything. And I need to know the full provenance of this material, where the bus came from, how long you've had it, everything. John's stomach dropped. That sounded like a man about to tell him it was stolen. That sounded like a man about to disappear with his collection into some legal machinery that would swallow him. But he brought everything the next day anyway. Had no choice. Couldn't live in the bus knowing what was there without knowing what it meant. Vane spent 6 hours examining the collection. He had colleagues come in, a woman named Shara who specialized in stamps, a man named Derek who knew coins. They worked in silence mostly, making notes, taking photographs, conferring quietly. John sat in an uncomfortable chair and watched his future get sorted into categories and grades. When they finished, Vane turned to him and said the words John had been terrified of since he first opened that compartment. This is real. All of it. Authentic. The British Guiana variant alone is worth approximately $450,000 at current market. The stamps collection, conservatively, $800,000. The coins, depending on condition and rarity, perhaps $600,000 more. Conservative estimate, low end, $800,000. High estimate, closer to $2 million. John stopped breathing. But, Vane continued, and John's hope flinched, you have a legal problem. Ownership of this material is unclear. The bus was sold to you, but the previous owner may have had heirs. There may be insurance claims. There may be questions about how this collection was acquired in the first place. You need to report this find, properly, and you need legal counsel. John felt the weight shift, not from poverty to wealth, from poverty to responsibility, from nothing to something so fragile it might shatter. What do I do? He asked. First, Vane said, you prove you own this bus legally. Then you find a lawyer, a good one. The lawyer's name was Patricia Chen, and she had the kind of calm that comes from having seen worse. John met with her 3 days after the appraisal. He brought the bus registration, the purchase receipt, everything he had proving he'd bought the vehicle legally. Chen reviewed the paperwork with the same precision Vane had used examining the stamps. The bus is yours, she said. Clean title, no liens. The previous owner sold it to the dealer, and the dealer sold it to you. The contents belong to the owner of the bus. That's you. John felt something loosen in his chest. He'd been holding his breath without realizing it. What about the original collector? He asked. The person who built the compartments. Chen did some digging, found the registration history. The bus had been registered to a man named Arthur Penhaligon for 37 years. Penhaligon had died in 1998. His estate had gone to probate, but the bus wasn't mentioned in the inventory. It had been parked in a storage lot, forgotten, paid for annually through an old account until the account finally lapsed. No heirs had claimed it. The storage company had eventually sold it for back fees. It had changed hands 3 more times before ending up in that lot where John found it. Arthur Penhaligon had been a collector, a serious one. He traveled extensively, bought pieces across decades, built a collection that represented a lifetime of passion. When he died, his family either didn't know what he'd hidden in the bus or they didn't care enough to look. The collection is yours to sell, Chen said, but I'd recommend doing it properly. Auction house, reputable dealers, build a chain of custody, get everything documented. It protects you legally and maximizes the value. John took her advice. Vane recommended Sotheby's for the high-end pieces. The stamps went first. A series of sales over 3 months, each piece authenticated, each sale documented. The British Guiana variant sold for $430,000. The Jenny inverts and other rare stamps brought another $350,000 across multiple lots. The coins took longer. They were sold to different dealers, specialized collectors who understood the nuances of numismatic value. Sales came through in waves, 10,000 here, 40,000 there. A particularly rare American dime with a mint error brought $85,000 alone. By the end of 6 months, the money had stopped coming. Not because he'd run out of pieces, but because he'd sold the most valuable ones. The total was less than Vane's high estimate, but well above the conservative one. $1.3 million sitting in a bank account in his name. John moved out of the bus. He found a small apartment near Amelia's school, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where he could cook real food. He paid 6 months' rent in advance and watched the landlord's expression shift from wariness to respect. He paid off the debt that had buried him. He set aside $200,000 for Amelia's education. He didn't buy anything expensive, didn't take a vacation, didn't celebrate. He was quiet about it. Ordinary. Just a man who'd gotten his footing back. But at night, he'd sometimes think about Arthur Penhaligon, a man who'd spent his life collecting beauty and rarity, preserving things worth keeping, who'd built a vault into a bus and then died, leaving no map for where the treasure was hidden. Penhaligon's collection had been forgotten, then found, then saved. Not by his family, by a stranger, by someone who needed it exactly as much as it needed to be found. Arthur Penhaligon had been a different kind of man than John. He'd had money. He'd had time. He'd had the freedom to chase passion across continents.
But somewhere beneath the surface, John understood him anyway.
Because what Penhaligon had done, building those compartments, preserving those pieces, hiding them so carefully, that wasn't about thievery or paranoia. That was about devotion. That was about refusing to let something precious disappear. John researched Penhaligon in his spare time, found old auction catalogues with his name listed as a bidder, tracked down letters in collector forums where someone had mentioned buying from him decades earlier. Penhaligon had been a serious buyer, not a casual hobbyist, a man who travelled to stamp auctions in Switzerland, who bid on rare coins from estate sales, who understood provenance and condition and the difference between good and irreplaceable. He'd built his collection across 40 years, across continents, across a lifetime of finding and preserving. When Penhaligon got older, when his health started failing, he'd made a choice. Instead of leaving the collection to lawyers or relatives who might not understand what he'd gathered, he'd sealed it away, built those compartments, climate-controlled, protected, hidden in plain sight. A bus, a vessel, a way to keep everything together and safe. Maybe he'd meant to document where it was. Maybe he'd planned to leave instructions in his will. Maybe he'd simply run out of time. What mattered was this. The collection had survived. It had waited. It had found someone who needed it as much as it needed to be saved. John decided to document the collection's story before the pieces scattered. He photographed each item, wrote notes about its origin, its significance, its place in Penhaligon's larger vision. He created a record, not for sale, for preservation, a way to honor what Arthur had spent his life building and protecting. Vane helped. Even the dealers who'd bought the coins came back with their own documentation, their own expertise. Slowly, a portrait emerged of a man devoted to something larger than himself. The collection wasn't just about value, it was about witness. Every stamp, every coin, every carefully preserved piece was a small piece of history that someone had decided mattered enough to save. Penhaligon had made that decision. Now John was making it too, but differently. Not by hiding it, by honoring it. There's a coin on a shelf in John's apartment. Nothing particularly valuable. A common British penny from the 1920s. It sits beside a framed photograph of him and Amelia, both of them smiling, both of them breathing easier now. He kept it from the collection because it reminded him of something, of worth that isn't visible, of treasure hiding in plain sight all around us, waiting for someone to care enough to look. The bus is gone now, sold for scrap, repurposed. Its secret served its purpose. John didn't become wealthy overnight in any flashy sense. He became stable, safe. He could breathe. He could think past tomorrow. But the real discovery wasn't the money. It was the understanding that everything abandoned, everything worthless to everyone else, might be priceless to someone. If you're paying attention. If you're desperate enough to look close. Subscribe, because somewhere in your life, something is waiting.